Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a closer look at Surah Al-Nisa, also known as women in the Quran. Um, I gotta say, this chapter always gets me thinking. It's a real mix of topics.
hmm
We've got marriage, inheritance, war, and even some back and forth between different faiths.
You're right. It's a fascinating chapter. Al-Nisa has sparked so much discussion and debate among scholars. It's really rich and complex, that's for sure.
And it's long. I mean, seriously long. One of the longest in the Quran. Plus, it was revealed in Medina right after the Battle of Uhud, so there's a whole lot of historical context to keep in mind.
Definitely. You can't really understand any chapter in the Quran without thinking about the history behind it. Al-Nisa is no different. It came at a time when the Muslim community was going through some big changes, lots of social and political stuff happening.
So let's jump right into the text. We get these really detailed instructions about marriage, inheritance, and how to treat orphans, almost like a legal code, laying down the rules for families and society.
Yeah, and it's important to remember these rules were a big deal back then. Like the Quran's focus on the rights of women and orphans, totally different from what was happening in Arabia before Islam.
The inheritance laws are really specific, like who gets what. I was surprised by how detailed it was. Sons getting double what daughters inherit, husbands getting more than wives if they have kids. Makes you think about Islamic law and gender roles.
You've hit on some key points there. Scholars have different takes on these verses, but the general idea is that the Quran was trying to make inheritance fair and keep society stable, while also recognizing the roles men and women had in families back then.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense thinking about the time period. But how do these laws work in today's world? Things are different now, gender roles and money stuff.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Muslim communities are still debating this. Some scholars say we need to understand these verses in today's context with our modern economy and all. Others say, no, stick to the original interpretations.
It's amazing how a text from so long ago can still spark these conversations,
Yeah.
still relevant today. It shows how the Quran is always connecting with what people are going through.
Exactly. That's what makes studying Al-Nisa so interesting. It's a peek into how the early Muslims lived, their values, their ethics, their laws. And it makes us think about our own values today, how we deal with family, community, and being fair in our own time.
Okay, so something else that really caught my eye in Al-Nisa was the language. In verse 4.24, it uses this word musanat to describe women who are, well, okay to marry. But there's a lot of back and forth about what that word really means, and that changes how we see the whole verse, right?
Oh, absolutely. Musanat is a perfect example of how just one word can lead to totally different interpretations. Some scholars say it means married women, while others say it means chaste women. And that impacts who's eligible for marriage, according to this verse.
So even when Al-Nisa is laying down the law, it's not always black and white. There's room for discussion and different opinions. It's a good reminder that understanding the Quran takes more than just reading the words. You got to think about history and the little details of the language, too.
You got it. And don't forget to check out what scholars have to say about these tricky parts. They can really help us understand the deeper issues.
Now, Al-Nisa doesn't just talk about what's happening within the Muslim community. It also deals with relationships with other religions, especially Jews and Christians. Some of what it says sounds kind of tense,
Right.
like it's making some strong theological points.
Yeah, there are definitely parts of Al-Nisa that criticize certain Jewish and Christian beliefs. For example, verse 4.46 says some Jews twisted the scriptures, and 4.171 questions the whole Trinity idea in Christianity.
This isn't just a friendly chat about religion. It feels like it's going right to the heart of their beliefs, challenging them.
Well, you got to remember when and where these verses were revealed. It was a specific time and place, and these passages are part of the conversations that were happening between different faiths back then.
So maybe they sound harsh to us now, but we have to see them as part of a bigger historical conversation, right?
Exactly. Plus, even with these critiques, the Quran still sees Jews and Christians as people of the book. That means they're people who have also received revelation from God. So there's this shared monotheistic foundation, even though some beliefs are challenged.
This idea of a shared heritage connects to the word Hanif, which pops up a few times in Al-Nisa. What does that mean exactly? Why is it important?
Hanif is a big deal in Islamic thought. It's key to how the Quran sees monotheism. Basically, it's about believing in one God, pure and simple, without any idols or anything like that.
So, like going back to the basics, the roots of believing in one God.
Yeah, exactly. And in Al-Nisa, it specifically says Abraham was a Hanif. That connects Islam to the monotheistic traditions that came before it. It's saying that Islam isn't brand new, but builds on that original message of one God.
Wow. So Al-Nisa isn't just giving rules for the Muslim community. It's also about where Islam fits in the bigger picture of history and religion. It's tracing that line of monotheism all the way back to Abraham and saying, hey, come join this path of pure belief.
That's a really good point. And this emphasis on Hanif helps us see why the Quran critiques other faiths. It's not saying they're completely wrong, but it's calling them back to that pure monotheism the way Islam understands it.
I like that. It's a nuanced approach to interfaith dialogue, something we could all learn from today. Being respectful, recognizing what we have in common, but also being honest about our own beliefs. We're getting close to the end of the first part of Chapter 4, and my brain is already doing gymnastics. This is a dense text.
It is.
So I think we need a little break here. Let this all sink in before we dive into the next part.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's a fascinating chapter in that way, how it kind of weaves together these legal pronouncements with these really profound theological statements.
Right. Like, it's not just about, like, rules, but it's trying to give you, like, a whole worldview.
Exactly.
Building it brick by brick.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of those bricks are pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Especially when we get to those verses about fighting and war.
Yeah.
It's almost jarring, right?
It is
to go from, like, inheritance laws to calls to battle.
It is a definite shift in tone. But if we look closely at verses, say, 7:1 through 77, we see the Quran kind of outlining the motivations for engaging in what it calls holy war. You know, it's not like it's glorifying violence,
Right.
but it does present fighting for a righteous cause as a form of sacrifice. And it even kind of paints this picture of, you know, those who might hesitate to fight.
So there's this tension there, right?
Yes.
Between reluctance and duty. Makes you wonder about the people, the individuals who are actually wrestling with these commands in real time.
Absolutely. And the Quran actually acknowledges that internal struggle. It goes on to explain that the act of fighting is presented as kind of this transaction where the warrior offers their life to God and in return is promised paradise, you know, either immediately if they're slain in battle or later if they survive.
So almost like a spiritual contract.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. A way of framing, you know, the risks and rewards of fighting for this higher cause. But the chapter doesn't just, you know, focus on the motivations of the warriors themselves. It talks about who they're fighting for.
And this is where I imagine the interpretation gets really tricky.
Yeah.
Because verse 75, it's often understood as like a reference to Mecca.
Right.
Suggesting there were Muslims who needed protection from like the polytheistic leaders there. But the text itself isn't, like, super specific, is it?
No, it's not. It's not super clear about the location or, like, who exactly the enemy is.
It's like a coded message that we're still trying to, like, decipher. And the language gets even more intense in verse 76.
Yes.
With the use of that term, takat.
Yes, takat, complex term. Often translated as false deity or idol. So it's a way of framing the conflict as this kind of cosmic battle between, you know, the forces of God and the forces of falsehood. It's also, I think, important to remember that this term, you know, it has roots in other religious traditions, you know, Aramaic, for example.
Oh, interesting.
So it highlights, you know, how the Quran is engaging with the beliefs and practices of its time.
So it's not just about, like, a physical fight, but about this, like, upholding truth, resisting those who, you know, perpetuate falsehood.
Absolutely.
It's this moral dimension to the conflict, which makes it even more complex.
Yeah. And it's not just about fighting with, you know, swords and shields.
Right.
Verse 77, it actually calls out those who might be very devout in their prayers, you know, in their charitable giving, but hesitate when it comes to actively fighting for their faith.
So true faith requires action.
It does, yeah. It suggests that, you know, it's not enough to just, you know, to go through the motions.
Right.
You have to be willing to defend what you believe in, even when it's dangerous.
It's a call to courage, you know, stepping outside of your comfort zone, even when it's scary.
Absolutely.
Speaking of scary, chapter 4 deals with this whole concept of hypocrisy. And those verses, wow, they don't hold back.
They really don't.
Verse 61, it warns against those who, you know, they might claim to be believers, but secretly they're harboring doubts or even ill intentions. It's a reminder that true faith isn't just about, like, outward appearances.
No.
It's about, like, the purity of your heart, the sincerity of your actions.
Exactly.
And that's a theme, it feels like, that echoes throughout the whole chapter.
It really does, yeah. And, it comes up again, verses 88 through 91,
Yeah.
where it paints this picture of those who they profess belief but then refuse to kind of live up to the commitments that come with it. They might, hesitate to migrate to Medina,
Right.
where the Muslim community was, trying to establish itself, or, that they might shy away from participating in battles. And the Quran is very clear that true belief, it requires action.
You have to be willing to, like, stand with your community.
You do, yeah, even when it's difficult.
So it's about walking the walk.
It is, not just talking the talk.
And there's some, there are consequences for those who get caught in this web of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Verse 88 says that God will cast them back, essentially removing them from the community of believers.
Right. They're seen as having kind of reverted to a state of disbelief. And that has implications, both in this life and the next.
Wow. It's a powerful statement about, like, the importance of integrity, authenticity. We've talked about fighting. We've talked about hypocrisy, pretty heavy stuff. But chapter 4 also gets into some pretty specific situations, like accidental killing.
Right.
What happens when, a believer unintentionally takes the life of another believer?
Yeah.
Verse 92 kind of lays out some guidelines. What do you think?
Yeah. It's actually a really fascinating example of how the Quran seeks to balance justice with mercy. So in these cases, the person who committed this act, they're not, subject to the typical punishments for murder. Instead, they have to free a believing slave and pay compensation to the victim's family.
So there's an element of restitution there.
There is, yeah. Making amends, even though it was unintentional.
But what if they couldn't afford to free a slave?
Right, good question. The Quran actually provides an alternative, fasting for 2 consecutive months. So it's a way of acknowledging the severity of the act, but also offering a path to atonement that's accessible, to those who might not have the means.
So, like, here's the ideal.
Yeah.
But if you can't do that, here's another way. It's pretty pragmatic.
Yeah, it is.
But then things take kind of a darker turn in verse 93 when it comes to intentionally killing a believer.
Yeah, the language there is very clear. His recompense is hell, abiding therein. God is wroth with him and curses him, and prepares for him a mighty punishment. So it's drawing a very, very sharp distinction between those unintentional acts and these deliberate transgressions, really highlighting the gravity of, taking a life on purpose.
Yeah. Stark contrast to that previous verse where there's, that room for forgiveness.
Yeah.
Makes me think about repentance. Like, what does it really take to repent for those actions, especially ones with, like, such severe consequences?
Yeah, good question. The Quran addresses that directly in verses 146 and 147. And these verses, they really emphasize the importance of turning back to God with sincerity, making amends for the harm that you've caused, and steadfastly holding to the path of righteousness.
So not just about feeling sorry,
No.
but about really, like, changing your behavior, aligning your will with God's will.
Exactly.
That makes sense. It makes me think, too, about, like, the relationship between those who are in positions of authority and the community as a whole. Verses 59 and 83 talk about, like, the importance of obeying those in authority. But there's a caveat there, isn't there?
Yeah, for sure.
What's that?
The verses go on to say that if you have a disagreement with, an authority figure, you should refer the matter back to God and the messenger.
Oh, okay.
So it's a reminder that ultimate authority, it doesn't lie with any, individual leader, but with God and the guidance that's been revealed through the prophet.
So it's almost like this check and balances system.
Yeah.
Making sure that power doesn't become absolute.
Yeah.
And that accountability, it's like it's woven throughout this whole chapter, isn't it?
It is.
From individual actions to the conduct of those in positions of power.
Exactly. It's not just about, blind obedience.
Right.
It's about, individual conscience, critical thinking. You're not just expected to, blindly follow orders,
Right.
but to actually engage
Right.
with the teachings of the Quran and the example of the prophet to arrive at your own understanding.
Be an active participant in your faith, not just a, passive follower.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about fighting, hypocrisy, repentance, authority. We're hitting, like, all the major themes of human existence here.
Yeah.
But then there's these verses that talk about the day of judgment.
Yeah.
And they just feel so vivid,
Yeah.
almost cinematic.
They are very evocative.
It's like this looming reminder, that that everything we do, it matters. This earthly existence is just a prelude to something much greater.
Absolutely.
But what about those who might try to, like, deceive God?
Right.
Like, can they escape accountability?
Good question. Verses 142 and 143, they address that pretty directly. They describe those hypocrites
Right.
who might try to conceal their true intentions, put on this show of piety while secretly, they're harboring all these doubts. And the Quran warns that God sees through those facades
Yeah.
and that he knows the secrets of every heart. There's no escaping his judgment.
Actions speak louder than words. And true faith, you can't fake it.
I can't.
So what about those who do genuinely strive to follow God's path? What's their reward?
Well, verse 122, it offers this beautiful, beautiful vision of their destiny. It describes gardens beneath which rivers flow, where they will dwell forever with purified spouses, enjoying cool shade.
Wow, that sounds nice.
It's a really powerful message of hope and encouragement. It's urging believers to persevere
Yeah.
on that path of righteousness.
What a contrast.
Yeah.
It's like the Quran is laying out these two paths, one leading to darkness and despair, the other to light and fulfillment.
Yeah. I like that.
It's a powerful reminder that even amid the challenges, the complexities of this life, there's a promise of something greater, something that makes all of those struggles worthwhile.
Absolutely.
What other kind of themes emerge in this final section of Chapter 4? What else is going on?
Well, there's this really powerful emphasis on truth and justice, particularly when it comes to the issue of bearing false witness. Verses 135 and 136, they offer some pretty stark warnings about the dangers of distorting the truth, especially, in legal matters.
So it's a call for, like, integrity.
It is.
Uphold the truth even when it's difficult.
Yeah.
Or inconvenient.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not just about, legal proceedings, right?
Right.
It extends beyond the courtroom.
Yeah, it's about all our actions.
It is. It's about our interactions, being honest, speaking truth to power, standing up for what's right, across the board.
It's a reminder that our words, they have power, and we have a responsibility to use them wisely, ethically. It's it's a big deal.
It is. And that sense of responsibility, it extends to our actions as well.
Right.
Chapter 4 also emphasizes, the importance of fulfilling our obligations to those in need.
Okay.
Verses 36 and 37, for example, they talk about the importance of showing kindness to our neighbors, regardless of their faith, their social status, anything.
Extending compassion beyond our immediate circles. It's recognizing that shared humanity that connects us all.
Exactly. And the Quran, it's not just about these, warm, fuzzy feelings.
Exactly.
It actually lays out practical ways to show that compassion, giving charity, offering a helping hand, speaking kind words, It's about turning that belief into action, making the world a more just, a more compassionate place.
It's putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
Or your actions where your faith is.
Right,
That's
exactly, yeah.
Powerful stuff.
And with that, I think we're ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive. We'll take a closer look at some specific verses and explore the lasting legacy of this amazing chapter.
One verse that really stood out to me was 4.34, the one about disagreements between husbands and wives. It sparked a lot of debate, especially in modern times. We need to approach this one carefully with sensitivity, understanding the historical and theological context.
Absolutely. Verse 4.34 is one of the tougher verses in An-Nisa, and it needs careful interpretation. It talks about steps a husband can take if his wife is disobedient or defiant. It starts with talking to her, then separating in bed, and lastly, physical discipline. That last part has caused a lot of controversy and criticism, with some saying it condones domestic violence.
Of course, any interpretation that justifies violence or abuse is totally wrong. But I also know that taking verses out of context can lead to misunderstandings. So how do we make sense of this verse while considering the Islamic emphasis on justice, compassion, and the well-being of everyone in the family?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's crucial to emphasize that most scholars interpret this verse within the framework of Islamic teachings that put mercy, compassion, and the well-being of all family members front and center. They stress that physical discipline, as mentioned in this verse, is an absolute last resort, only for extreme situations and with the utmost restraint.
So it's not saying physical punishment is okay. but more like a carefully limited measure for very specific circumstances.
Right. And a lot of scholars point out that the Arabic word translated as strike can also mean a light tap or a symbolic gesture, not a beating. And the main goal of this verse is not to punish, but to reconcile and keep the family together.
So it's about dealing with a serious issue in the marriage, but the focus is on communication, understanding, and ultimately trying to heal the relationship.
Precisely. It's vital to refer to reputable scholarly sources and avoid interpretations that encourage violence or try to justify abuse. The Quran as a whole emphasizes treating women with dignity, respect, and kindness, so any interpretation that goes against that is wrong.
That's important. We have to be careful not to let interpretations that twist the Quran's meaning to justify harmful actions slip through.
Definitely. And this discussion about verse 4.34 highlights something important about understanding the Quran as a whole. Context matters. We can't just pull out a verse and interpret it on its own. We have to consider the historical context, the subtle meanings of the language, and the overall message of the Quran to get an accurate and balanced understanding.
And we should also refer to scholarly interpretations and commentaries. The Quran is a complex text. It takes serious study and thought to really grasp it.
I agree. It's not a book you can just skim and think you understand. It requires our attention, our effort to think critically, and a willingness to engage with its wisdom on many different levels.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Jesus.
Okay.
He's obviously a central figure in both Christianity and Islam.
Absolutely.
How does chapter 4 portray him?
It affirms his role as a messenger of God, but it also very firmly rejects the idea of his divinity and the concept of the Trinity.
So it's trying to thread a very fine needle,
Yes.
acknowledging his importance in his prophetic role,
Right.
but drawing a very clear line between him and God.
Yes.
Are there any verses that really capture this distinction?
Verse 4.171 is pretty explicit. It
Okay.
calls Jesus a spirit from God and a word from him,
Right.
but it refutes the idea that he is God himself.
Okay.
And this verse also contains the only direct refutation of the Trinity in the Quran.
So the Quran is trying to both clarify its own understanding of Jesus
Yes.
and address what it sees as misconceptions
Right.
within other faiths.
Exactly.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Okay, what about the verse about the crucifixion? 4.157.
It's a verse that has generated centuries of debate
I bet.
and interpretation.
What's the Quran's take on that?
So the traditional understanding is that God made someone else appear as Jesus,
Okay.
and that person was crucified instead,
So Jesus wasn't actually crucified.
sparing Jesus from that fate.
That's a pretty significant departure
Yes, it is.
from the Christian narrative.
It is.
Are there other interpretations of that verse?
Some scholars argue that the verse isn't meant to be taken literally.
Right.
They suggest that it could be emphasizing that it was ultimately God's will for Jesus to die, even if others carried out the act.
So it's more about God's ultimate authority
Right.
over life and death
Yeah, exactly.
than a literal substitution on the cross.
Yes.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
It shows how much room there is for interpretation,
Absolutely.
even within the same faith.
Right.
But ultimately, what happens to Jesus according to chapter 4?
Verse 4.158 states that God raised Jesus up to himself after his death.
Okay.
This is a key element of Islamic belief,
Okay.
that Jesus wasn't crucified but was saved by God and ascended to heaven.
Okay, so no resurrection in the traditional Christian sense.
Right.
But there is this idea of ascension.
Yeah.
Does chapter 4 say anything about Jesus's potential return in the future?
It does. Verse 4.159 hints at a special role for Jesus at the end of time.
Okay.
Although the exact nature of that role is open to interpretation.
Okay.
But it reinforces the idea that Jesus remains a significant figure
Okay.
in Islamic eschatology even after his ascension.
So even after his death and ascension,
Yeah.
Jesus' story isn't over.
Not at all.
It's like chapter 4 is setting the stage
Right.
for a future act in this cosmic drama.
Exactly.
Chapter 4 doesn't just address these big theological debates.
Right.
It also zooms in on seemingly mundane things like the importance of greetings.
Oh, yeah.
Why would a chapter dealing with such weighty topics
Right.
dedicate space to something as commonplace as saying hello?
Well, it might seem trivial at first glance,
Right.
but the way we interact with each other,
It's
even in those small everyday moments,
Yeah.
reflects our deeper values.
Okay.
Verse 4.86 encourages responding to greetings. With an even better greeting, or at least returning the greeting in kind.
Okay.
It's a subtle reminder that even simple acts of courtesy
Right.
can contribute to a more harmonious society.
It's like those small gestures of respect are
Yes,
the building blocks
exactly.
of a more peaceful and connected community.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the close of our deep dive into Surah An-Nisa. We've explored so much, haven't we? From the personal and intimate aspects of life to the wider social and political spheres, from practical matters to the spiritual realm. I truly hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of this incredible chapter, its depth and complexity.
It's been a privilege to journey through this exploration with you. May you continue to engage with the Quran and its profound teachings long after our deep dive has concluded.
Thank you for being here with us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking knowledge.